So, some key questions when thinking about those different dimensions and the bigger general point of critically considering the user is, or sorry, I should say, key questions are what can a user do with their mouse, finger, or stylus to directly interact with the interface? Thinking about this helps you to define what's possible and also the limitations of your product. So, um, let's say you're designing something like a food ordering app. Most of the time, people are going to be doing that on their phone or on the go. So the limitation is that they don't have as much control over the screen or the ability to say roll over things or to double or triple tap. Um, or especially they don't have as much control as they would with a stylus where you're going to be drawing directly onto the screen and then inputting that information. So that doesn't mean that the product has to be so simple that it's dumbed down, but really it's more about streamlining that interface so that just using a finger where you can tap and drag, and those are possibly the only kinds of interactions, that lays it out really clearly in terms of what you can and can't do and what will fulfill what the user needs to do. What about the appearance? And we're thinking about color, shape, and scale here. Gives the user a clue about how it's going to function before they even start using it. This helps the user and us as well to think about behavior and to use our visual acuity as designers in order to create prompts or hints without having to lay out step-by-step instructions. And that's really what today's users want, is intuitive interfaces where they don't need to read instructions before they start to use the product. What feedback does a user get once an action is performed? So does the thing vibrate? Does it move? Does it change color? Does it grow in size? These allow us to ensure that the system provides a response in a reasonable time, which is usually within about 1 second or less, after the user does something so that they feel like something is happening and exchange is taking place. Are the interface elements a reasonable size and contrast to interact with? So this is more of an accessibility question. Are we meeting people halfway in terms of if they're elderly or young? Sometimes they need bigger text and they need simpler graphics that aren't as distracting to look at because it's harder to focus. Alternatively, you can also think about contrast just in terms of vision and the differences of ability, physical ability there, but also thinking about as well different times of day and brightness, relative brightness of screens. Um, are the user or is your user familiar with the format that you're using? And this goes for the design of the interface as well as maybe the device. So making sure that you're using some recognizable icons that are used consistently in other contexts and elements and formats from popular visual culture, such as the Wi-Fi symbol or the X in the top corner to close out a window. These are basic little, what we might call hallmarks of interaction design at this point, that reassure the user that they still know at least the basics of how to navigate what you've created, and they enhance the learnability. So your user will catch on and will know how to operate your product with less time and effort. Okay, so we're rounding down to the last part of the lecture here. I just want to talk quickly about some more theoretical concerns. This is what I was saying earlier, where interaction design does actually have the capacity to be philosophical in a way. So these things I want you to consider, but they're not as important in a technical kind of way as the others to learning the brass tacks of interaction design. But I think that these are far more interesting in terms of how interaction design can help and hopefully change society for the better, and also what makes it really exciting as a designer to work in this field for multiple years or decades. So the first theoretical concern with interaction design is one of phenomenology, and this is the study of bodily experience, what it means to have a body, how we still are physical, beings made of bone and flesh and gooey stuff, held in by skin, and yet we're interacting with all of these machines made of titanium and copper and plastic. And we can't cancel out the body or forget about it. It definitely still informs and affects the level and quality of experience. So, whenever we create something that is a digital product and interactive, we should be thinking about what are the limits and the potentials of virtual interaction, period. So, um, do we have realistic expectations? Are we thinking about the fact that our users are also bodies? They have physical bodies. They're not just users in the abstract sense, and they're definitely not just numbers or data. And then are we designing something that gets the most out of what's possible with virtual interaction, but not overextending it, or alternatively, maybe not exploring what's really possible there and keeping it too simple? Um, Second to that is, what does it mean to think about online environments and online bodies? So, kind of moving in the opposite direction, more and more people now have a sense that their digital life is not separate from their physical life, but that it has its own kind of qualities to it and its own sense of life online. So, when we design experiences for others, in especially in a web-based context, how can we critically think about the fact that they are maybe navigating the web or operating or performing their identities differently online than they would be in a physical context? And how can this inform the way that you're creating, you're designing, so that it's, again, serving people the best that it can, and also um, maybe creating a more rewarding experience of that online life? Okay, ethics is the other big one, the study of what is fair and or just in society. So this is very tricky, and I'm going to boil it down to just two questions. I know it seems crazy, but here we go. Okay, so this one's not even a question, it's just more of a command. Designers need to acknowledge that they have much more power than the user. So here I'm talking about this idea of power asymmetry. As the designer, you automatically have much more control over the kind of experience and the quality of the experience than your user does. Acknowledge that control and that power. Try to mitigate it by giving the user some agency or the ability to affect things, rather than having all of the aspects of the interface rigid and dictated to the user. See if there are ways that you can allow the user to customize that experience and also to express themselves a little bit. This is the only way to really combat what is otherwise an impossible to change power asymmetry, because as the maker of the thing, you will always have a much more intimate knowledge of it, and you'll always have much more control over what it is and how it behaves. So the user is already at a disadvantage. But thinking about equity and empowerment, are there ways that you can create opportunities for the user to get a little bit of that agency back? And then this one's the much more open and very philosophical one. What rights and freedoms should users enjoy? Users have to have limitations. That's just the way that it is. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using your product, they would just make their own. But many don't have the ability or the time to do that. Still, as we move more and more of our life online and depend on digital media for completing our everyday tasks, there really is this question of maintaining certain rights and freedoms in the online sphere as well as in real life. And what part do you have to play in that? You're not exempt from that. As a person designing digital interactions, you are very much in the thick of this question. And going forward on a professional level, you will need to consider, you know, what does every user, or what should every user be able to enjoy and be kind of guaranteed in any interactive, digital interactive experience that they embark upon. Okay, so the last thing, a final thought that I want to leave you with, is a parable. This comes from Indochina, so we're talking here about the a period of time in which the borders between what is modern day India and modern day China were a little bit more fluid. So we're not sure exactly where this parable comes from. We just know that it owes its origins to both cultures. So this is an ancient story about some very wise but blind men. So they are physically, legally blind, and they're asked by the ruling emperor at the time to identify a strange creature that he's acquired by feeling it. So they all start at different parts of the animal. None of them have seen an elephant before, and so they use the only other information available to them, which is their sense of touch. And we could also argue their sense of smell and hearing as well. I'm sure that that was part of it. But for this parable, they're really concentrating on what information they can take in through their fingers and hands. So one man says the tail is a snake because obviously it feels very thin and long and spindly and articulated like a snake. And that's based on his past experience, right? His lived experience of what a snake feels like. Another says it's a walrus because he's feeling the large tusks and he knows that the only animal he's seen elsewhere that has those is a walrus. While yet another feels the tough, scaly skin and is convinced that the animal is a dragon. So obviously, none of them are correct. But the point of this parable and why it matters to interaction design is that all of these blind men, as wise as they are, and intelligent and equipped in many other ways, is that much like the everyday user, they can only see and understand the bigger picture of what's in front of them if you, the designer, lets them. So it's this idea that if we're not um, if we're not sort of zooming out and all the user has is what's right in front of them to feel, um, then all that they're going to sense is a tusk. And maybe instead of an elephant, they think what you've created is a walrus. I know that that seems like a little bit of a stretched metaphor, but it's more about this idea, again, of empowering the user by making it very clear what the scale of your project is and finding ways to make it a little bit more transparent so that both the micro and the macro satisfy each other in terms of how much access to information a user has when they're navigating your product. So designing is a way to see both the details and the bigger picture in harmony together. And that way, no matter the abilities of a user, whether we're talking about literal or figurative here, so metaphorically blind or legally blind, that user will be able to still understand your message and get as much out of the interaction as any other user. All right, I know this is kind of a wild ride and we've covered a lot of ground, but I hope that these are some helpful insights for you and introductions to essential terms and concepts. Do make sure that you go back and review some of the key slides as you'll need to reference them for your first small group discussion. Thanks very much.